Alright, so if I can record this without losing the SD card, we'll be 2 steps ahead of the game. Alright guys, well, welcome back to a episode of Rolling with T-Bone. This episode of Rolling with T-Bone, if you're new here, welcome in. My name's T-Bone. If you're old here, welcome back. You know what's going on as we're rolling down the road on Blue Moon. Now, what I had made reference to earlier is I have laid my SD card down while I was editing videos, and I have no idea where it went. Luckily I had a backup in one of my other cameras, so there's 2 episodes of Rolling with T-Bone that I can't remember exactly what all I said in them. I remember what they were about, but I guess we will have to I guess we'll just have to start from scratch on those. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about a long-term review on the Blue Moon here. Now, this bike has a lot of pros and cons about it. Being a dyna, the biggest con I find is the vibration. The vibration between this and the Fat Boy is completely wild. Of course, they're 2 different bikes anyway. One solid mount, one rubber mount, which is where the vibration comes from. But I've ridden this bike now for a while. After I traded the Midnight Express for it, I've been riding this bike for a while, and to be honest with you, I've grown really fond of this bike. Now, this is only the 2nd dyna I've ever owned. The first one I owned was a numbered bike. It was a 91 Sturgeon, and to be honest with you guys, that's the one I wiped out and had my big wreck on, totaled it out. But I don't remember a lot about how that bike rode because of the time of my life that I got that bike, and I had it for just a short amount of time. But this bike right here, guys, I gotta tell you, I've grown really fond of it. Sounds good, runs good. Long term, now here's where we get into the difference in Softail and dyna. Long-term review is, for me on this bike, if you're looking for power, speed, something that you can have fun with, absolutely the dyna's the way to go. Now there's people out there that are dyna only. They won't ride anything else. Dyna lowrider, dyna super glide, dyna wide glides. You know, when back in the 90s, this is a 97 model. Both of the dynas that I've owned have been from the 90s. These bikes built in the 90s were very solid, if that makes any sense. They're just solid bikes. Solid mount, solid bikes. This dyna is actually, the Softail you would think is a little bit bigger bike. This dyna is actually heavier than the Softail is, believe it or not. So in shooting this content and then getting you a long-term review, I thought what I would just do is the pros and the cons. Okay, con number 1 being the vibrating. This thing, these dynas vibrate like crazy. Kind of like the old FXRs, they vibrate pretty good too. Solid mount FXRs. Pro is it's comfortable. After I got the bars changed, the seat's alright, the seat's comfortable. footing on my forward controls is comfortable. Of course, most of these dynas in the 90s came with midshift, so most of the time you see a dyna with forward controls on it, they're aftermarket. I think the Wide Glide was actually the only dyna that actually came out of the factory with forward controls, and I'm pretty sure I'm right about that. Most of the other dynas all had midshifts. Super Glide had midshifts, the Lowrider had midshifts. Now, one of the things that Harley-Davidson did in the 90s is that they took that whole decade and introduced a ton of motorcycles. They did a lot of special edition bikes, which they kicked off the decade of the 90s, 1990, of course. They kicked that off with the unveiling of the Fat Boy, which was Willie G's ride that he designed from scratch. The Fat Boy was a Willie G bike. And they did, in 91, they did the Sturgeon Glide. 92, or it might have been still in 91. I'm thinking, however, it was 92. They did a 50th anniversary bike for Daytona Bike Week, and it was called the Daytona Glide. They did a Sturgeon Glide, then they did a Daytona Glide. I know where one of the Daytona Glides are right now. No, it's not far from where I live. Gentleman who owns it, though, he probably wouldn't never part with it. But they did a Moo Glide. They just were into all kinds of stuff in the 90s. They were doing all kinds of specialty bikes in the 90s, which was rare, in that usually when they done a specialty bike, they did it for a couple years and then they just stuck back to the regular platform. But the Dyna Super Glide, this is a sporty version, which is why people think the Sportsters look a lot like these bikes. The Dyna Super Glide basically is the hopped up Sportster. It's a souped up Sportster, a big twin Sportster. It's got the 39mm front end on it. It shares the same fenders as the Sportster does. Tank's different, but it's just a whole lot more powerful than a Sportster. But the Dyna Lowrider was kind of the one that really it tripped everybody's trigger, because it really was a good looking bike. But the Dyna the Sturgeon Glide, I mean, they did that deep rich black paint job, you know, red Sturgis emblem on the side. Really, they did those beautifully, I thought. Of course, the Sturgis Glide was done 2 different decades. The first Sturgis Glide was done with a shovel head in 81, I believe it was. It's either 1980 or 1981. They did a Sturgis Glide. And then in 91, they did a Sturgis Glide with the Evo motor. And that was actually, the Sturgis Glide introduced the new frame that these bikes rode on the rest of the 90s, even up into the mid 2000s, I believe. But you know, the value of these bikes has doubled in the last 2 years. Of course, I mentioned that in a video just a little while back. They're real popular right now. I had a guy earlier, I was in Blue Ridge, I had to run a few errands, and he came up and he was talking about these bikes and the popularity of them. And right now their stock is rising, and I don't think it'll go back down since it's risen the way it has. Of course, I wouldn't give mine away either. I mean, I like the fact that the value doubled myself. But the Dyna, in the 90s, the Fat Boy was the bike. I mean, there were telephones modeled after it. All the toys were modeled after the Fat Boy. The Fat Boy is the most recognizable Harley-Davidson built. But you got people that jump on the Dynas, and I mean, I love riding this bike on the back roads like I'm doing right now. This bike's fun out on the back roads. Of course, this one's lowered 2 inches, and the rear end's been lowered 2 inches. I thought about raising it back up to stock height, but I like it being lowered because I don't really have to have that high center of gravity. I'm kind of versatile enough that I can ride either way, I guess. But one of the pros that I really love about these bikes is they're valuable, but their value, it goes up and it holds. And now motorcycles that came out of the 90s are starting to get that patina on them, kind of like the bikes from the 70s and the 80s did in the 90s. You know, back in the 90s, them old school riders that rode panheads and shovelheads hated the dynas, and they really hated softails. Oh, old bikers would give us, the young guys who, well, not me, I didn't ride a softail but back then, but man, if you rode a softail, you were a marked man with them old bikers. They would haze you and razz you. Oh my God, it was miserable. I actually got to feeling bad for people who rode softails, although I thought you know, I've talked about it here many times before on this channel. The television series Renegade, he rode an '89 softail custom, and I thought that was the best looking Harley Davidson in the 90s, to be honest with you. I've often wanted to get a hold of anywhere between an '89 to a '93 softail custom and kind of paint it up and do the paint scheme of the Renegade on it. The old 50s hot rod flames. I mean, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't too glitzy, but it had the right amount of chrome. Good looking black paint with the old 50 style hot rod flames on it. It was a good looking bike. It was really a trend setting bike in the 90s. But man, I'll tell you, the dyna riders didn't get hazed as much, I don't think, as the softail guys did, but even the dyna riders would get hazed just a little bit, especially when it came to the guys, them old guys who only rode old panhead choppers or shovelhead choppers. They would haze anybody that had a swing arm or a set of shocks in the back. But the dyna, being around as long as it has, the Super Glide's been around since '76. They really have and that's another pro, is this bike comes from a long lineage. The Super Glide. Now, I'm not talking about the Lowrider or any of the other dynas. I'm talking strictly about the Super Glide. The Super Glide comes from a long lineage. And of course, in the 80s, the Lowrider got popular. I think '84, when they did the first year Evos, that's what really took off with the Lowrider, because the Lowrider was basically just a stripped down FXR, which, you know, that's what and I meant to say this in that video the other day when I was talking about the value of these bikes. All these bikes' lineage come from the FXR. The FXR, if you look at the Lowrider ST today that Harley Davidson's putting out, the Lowrider ST is a direct descendant of the 1982 FXRT, which was the FXR touring bike. So essentially, if you didn't want to ride the big tour glide, you could still get a touring bike in the FXR, which it was raised up higher off the ground, came with the fairing. I think Windjammer did the fairings back then. It had the shorty bags on it. Still a touring bike, but it wasn't as big and bulky as the tour glide. So what those guys was doing back then, when they would get a hold of those FXRs, they would rip all that off, put a regular headlight bucket on it. It had the big wide fat bob tanks on them. Most of the FXR had the big fat tanks on them. They bobbed the rear fender, get rid of the bags, and then they'd slam them to the ground. One of the best examples I've seen recently of that was, of course, Chuck at Panhead City down in Rome, and of course, rest in peace, Chuck. We lost Chuck a few months back. He passed away. He had a 1980 slammed shovelhead that I really wanted. It was a FXR that had been slammed and stripped, and man, it was a beautiful bike. Beautiful bike. But I couldn't meet his price, and he wasn't interested in any trade, so I missed the opportunity to get it. But to be honest with you, it wasn't meant to be. I figure when it comes to stuff like that, if it's meant to be, you'll get it and there won't be no issues. But essentially, they would take those FXRs, strip them completely down, and which is something I never understood, because I didn't think they looked all that bad myself. But back then, that was the culture. If you didn't, you know, if they didn't want a chopper, they would bob a FXR. And I think they made beautiful bikes when they slammed them down like that. Of course, buddy of mine I hadn't got to ride with in a long time, Mike, he's got one of the shovel heads from the 80s that started out its life as a FXR, and he stripped it down, made a beautiful lowrider out of it. But I mean, that's kind of where I'm at with these bikes here, guys. Witches are a pro with these bikes because they're versatile enough that you can change things around on them. But now that style has come back around with the fairing, the bags, raising them up off the ground. I think the ST even comes with big controls. It's built to be a sport touring bike that you can get on the back roads and you can have a good time with. But, you know, I think about that, and I think about how much the culture was impacted in the 90s by the 80s. Man, everything changed after the 90s. You know, which if you're going to buy one of these old dynas, that's going to be a con for you. Especially if you rode a newer bike with all the technology, all the digital. Only thing digital on this thing is the mileage on the odometer. All analog, just the speedo and the tach. Very basic, that's all you have. Some of the other dynas right here where this is had clocks. But pull on out, it don't matter. But you know, if you get the opportunity to own a dyna, or you get the opportunity to pick up a dyna at a good price that it's not going to cost you a ton of money, and you can get into it. But of course, right now, if you go to buy one, I'm sorry, you're not going to pick one up for a dance right now. You're going to have to pay for them if you get them right now. So there you go, guys. That's kind of my long-term review on the Dyna Super Glide 97. The only other Dyna that I can really say that I could have owned, but the price was too high, and I did a lot of research on them. They only built them 1 year. Was the Dyna Super Glide Sport. The Dyna Super Glide Sport. It was a blacked out Dyna that they built. It's either 2000 or 2001. They made them for 1 year, but I got to see one, got to sit on it, didn't get to ride it. But beautiful bike. It blacked out. It was kind of like a souped up night train, but all blacked out, and it was a Super Glide Sport. So if you get a chance to ever pick one of those up, you know, go for it. But I'm gonna Dyna, you know, there's pros and cons all the way around on this bike. People love them or people hate them. There really ain't no middle ground. And the people who love them spend a lot of money on them, customizing them, decking them out. Just go to Google and type in Dyna Super Glide, Dyna Lowriders, and you can see what people are doing to them. But I'll tell you what, guys, thank y'all for coming with me on this ride, hanging out with me as we do a long-term review. Long-term review is I love the bike. I don't see me getting rid of it unless somebody pops up with maybe an 89 to a 93 Softail Custom. That would be about the only thing that would pry the dyno away from me. But tell you what, guys, y'all take care of yourselves and each other. And then I'll see you the next time.